Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Live from the Blue Seats. It's just me, producer JL, today. A lot of us had some stuff going on, just kind of getting in the way. Life happens. So it's just me today for this week. Rob and Dave will hopefully be back next week to, give their take on what's gone on in Rangerland so far, or Rangerstown, rather. But I hope you're doing okay. We had the time change. It's been a bit rough for a lot of us, especially me. But, I hope that you're doing okay. And I hope that everything is well in your world. And if it's not, then I hope that this podcast can distract you from whatever is ailing you in the time being. But if, you are doing well, that's great to hear. You know who is doing well? Funny enough, the New York Rangers. I know, great segue, right? Producer JL. So, since we last recorded, uh, the Rangers have knocked off 3 wins in a row. you know, even though they lost to the Devils 6-3, which I was unfortunately at, they were able to beat the Flyers in Philadelphia 6-2, and then beat the Calgary Flames 4-0. And then yesterday, which I'm recording this on Friday the 13th, ooh, bad luck. On the Thursday, the day before the day I'm recording this, they beat the Winnipeg Jets 6-3. Now, all this in a nutshell to say that, are we talking playoffs? No. That ship has long sailed. They would have to win out to get 98 points, and that really kind of gets them sort of in the discussion, but it wouldn't exactly guarantee a spot. But it essentially would not really benefit them to do that. Obviously, I'm not going to tell the team to just start losing, but, they're playing some pretty good hockey so far, and especially coming off of the break. And they're hitting some sort of stride that I think was missing at the beginning of the season. And a lot of that is really coming from Alexis Lafreniere, Gabriel Perreault, and Mika Zibanejad. And Mika is not only killing it, but Lafreniere and Perreault are absolutely killing it. I mean, you're beginning to see the raw skill that a lot of these guys have. Now, everybody's thinking, well, where the heck was this early on in the season? Well, you kind of have to think about it this way. They shipped off a lot of assets, and the players who are supposed to play in these skill positions are finally playing in skill positions. The Rangers did the right thing in allowing Gabe Perreault to stay up here, regardless of whatever struggles he was having. The good thing that they did was they allowed Perreault to stay up here, allow him to get used to the game, allow him to get comfortable with the NHL speed, and kind of begin to acclimate to what an NHL player should do. And after the break, I mean, even before the break, he was playing reasonably well, but after the break coming back from the Olympics, he's just looked on fire. Same goes for Alexis Lafreniere. Everybody wanted to trade him, and there was a lot of disappointment there because we weren't really getting the Lafreniere that we were supposed to get for the draft. But he's really beginning to kind of pick his play up, and the encouraging thing about this is that oh yeah, he had that little run in 2022 where he was, pretty decent and was one of our best forwards in the playoffs. But this is a bit different because his 5-on-5 metrics are just through the roof this year. And he's actually been a positive possession player, even when he wasn't putting pucks into the back of that. I mean, he always really has been a positive possession player. But I think the big thing out of all of this is pretty much the results of the Rangers trading Artemi Panarin. Now, a lot of people were disappointed at the trade. I was very well documented at being disappointed at the return. But the more that I think about it, and yeah, they could have probably gotten more for it. I will maintain that thought, and I know Dave and Rob would say the same. But I think, though, now, if this all goes according the way that it should, trading Artemi Panarin, not to say you want to trade him for peanuts, but the fact that they traded him essentially kind of freed up Lafreniere. Lafreniere is a natural left winger. Gabe Perreault is currently playing right wing on that line with him and with Lafreniere and Zibanejad. But Panarin really was in the way, if you really think about it, because there is sort of this urgency that Lafreniere is playing with that we've expected from him. He looks more engaged. He looks more decisive with the puck. He doesn't seem as tentative in terms of trying to, not make mistakes or, he's just out there playing hockey. Now, this could just be the result of the team not being in playoff contention and they're just saying we're going to play hockey, screw it. But at the same time, though, this is an encouraging sign because if they're beginning to build, you know, uh, good habits, then you know you can't get mad at that, and they they can carry that into next season. The line of Lafreniere, Perreault, and Zibanejad has just been such a treat to watch. You know, just over the last 6 games, uh, Gabe Perreault has 4 goals and 5 assists. Alexis Lafreniere has 6 goals and 5 assists. Mika Zibanejad has 9 points in his last 5. Including a couple of goals himself, including you know a solid performance against the Flyers on that Monday. I love when Mika Zibanejad torches the Flyers. It's great. It's like it's all. I mean, I should have put a bet on it that it would just been guaranteed that Mika would have had a point against the Philadelphia Flyers because it always happens, and it was great. It was also nice to witness that in person. But I think now what's going on is the Rangers are finally letting the kids take their spots. And yeah, even though Alexis Lafreniere is 24, 25 years old, he's still very young. So I hope that this is just the beginning of these guys blossoming into the top 6 forwards that we've expected them. Gabe Perreault is showing those signs a bit earlier than Lafreniere. Lafreniere has showed it in spurts, but with Lafreniere, you want consistency. And it seems as if with Artemi Panarin leaving, now you can talk about the whole discourse that's gone on that Panarin wasn't a good leader. Maybe he wasn't. And that, Lafreniere wasn't too keen on him. That can't really confirm. But it feels like there was this sort of weight lifted off of everybody. And it just seems as if they're just playing hockey, you know. And if they continue to develop good habits, then it's going to be a real good thing for this team. And also, too, another underrated acquisition on this team has been Ty Cartier. Ty Cartier, I mean, talk about a slam dunk waiver pickup so far. I mean, he's been absolutely phenomenal out there. I mean, I didn't think much of it, truth be told. I just thought, okay, well, they need another body. They just needed somebody there. But Ty Cartier has actually been very productive. I have to look up his numbers quickly, but he's been active, he's been engaged, he puts a lot of, he's very tough in the corners. He plays a hard game, you know, and ever since they claimed him, he's just been solid back there on that third line for the Rangers. So I'm looking for his stats. I saw this on Twitter somewhere as I'm scrolling through this hellhole of an app. But basically, there was something that I guess that was lacking on that third line, and I think we wanted to keep it. Oh, and it's also great too that he is going to be here next year, and he's not making a ton of money. I think he's making about 1.25 if I'm correct. But you know, it's just he's been very noticeable in the. So I went to. He scored against Winnipeg the other night. I want to say it was a deflection. I can't remember it too much. Yes, it was a deflection out in front of the net that gave the Rangers the lead. Um, so Ty Cartier, he he's been very noticeable. I think it's been 6 points in his last 4 games, I want to say. But okay, so he's been 7 games as a Ranger, 2 goals, 4 assists, 6 points. Okay, I think this is just phenomenal. I went to the Maple Leafs game, I went to the Devils game, and I went to the Flyers game. And out of all those 3 games, outside of the obvious, Zibanejad, Perreault, Adam Fox, Lafreniere, outside of the typical, Ty Cartier really stood out. Also, Connor Sheary looked pretty good too. But I think now with you know, with his addition, I think they found a solid bottom six for next season. You know, it seems like the organization's a bit disappointed in Brett Berard. Obviously, if they've traded Brendan Othman to Calgary, so you weren't really getting much out of him. And then I guess a couple other players are still down to the pipeline. But for the time being, right now, when you throw Cartier with Laba and Cooley, hopefully at the end of the day, that's probably a line you want to throw out next season, or maybe even this season if they're able to, round out the top two lines. I think that's pretty good. The Rangers. It all depends on how Chris Drury ends up managing this. But if you're looking at this strictly from just the situation that the team is currently in, they could probably add another defenseman, and then add two more forwards. One forward would potentially come from the draft. So you hope that even with all this winning, that the draft lottery favors them with at least a top 3, top 4 pick. Okay, so there's the possibility of Ivar Stenberg, Tynan Lawrence, Gavin McKenna, Manny Malhotra's kid, so you'll have one of those guys. And then you have the possibility of potentially adding a guy like Alex Tuck or maybe a Jason Robertson. My preference is Jason Robertson, but I'm not entirely sure how much of that RFA route Chris Drury wants to really go. But, Alex Tuck wouldn't be such a bad addition, especially, if they don't trade Vincent Trocheck, which I, still don't think they will, but they might surprise me in the summer. Who knows? But either way you look at it, whether you have Trocheck or not, and the Rangers have a ton of cap space coming up this summer, they can really put themselves in a decent position to be a team that can make noise next season. If this trend of, I guess, say good vibes continues into next season, because realistically, the reason why the quote unquote rebuild from before didn't really pan out was primarily because of the fact that Lafreniere and Kakko didn't live up to the expectations they should have at the time. But with Lafreniere really coming into his own, which I'm glad the team decided to exercise patience with him, because that the skill is there and it would come out in spurts, and it's very disappointing because you wanted to see him harness it. And I think finally now, and look, you can take this and quote me if I'm wrong, if this is just a flash in the pan, but this seems a bit different. And especially when you keep him with a guy like Gabe Perreault and you just have Mika Zibanejad there, just let them fly. This kind of reminds me of what happened when Gerard Gallant's job was on the line a couple years ago. That very infamous game against St. Louis, where if the Rangers had lost, Gerard Gallant would have gotten fired. Now, you can make a case on what would have happened if Gerard Gallant would have gotten fired at that time. Would anything have changed? Who would have come in and coached the team? Would the 2023 first round of the playoffs that year been any different? Because of, they wouldn't have Gerard Gallant's stubbornness that would have held them back in that first round series. But either way, the reason why I referenced that is because Gerard Gallant made a decision to put Lafreniere, Zibanejad, and Kakko together on the first line, bumping Chris Kreider down to the second line. And that night, every single one of them, or most of them, played pretty well. I want to say Lafreniere and Zibanejad got points. Kakko looked pretty good. I can't remember. I should have looked this up. Kakko probably ended up getting a point. But they looked really good, and then they tried it out for another game, and then they changed everything back. I mean, the team ended up winning despite Gerard Gallant, so they were just kind of on autopilot after a bit, and they ended up just doing enough to get in. Because, I mean, it still was a pretty decent team, but it was a bit different than it was in 2022 prior to that season. And obviously, getting beaten 7 against your arch rivals is not ideal, of course. But, ifs and buts for candies and nuts, who knows. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that even though they're winning games, and look, truth be told, they've won, a pretty decent amount of games since the break, and their position in the draft has, their position in the standings still hasn't really changed. They're still down in the bottom 4, bottom 5 of the league, So I guess hopefully that I don't want to. It's at the point where playoffs are basically dead, right? So I can't say, oh well, kind of hope that they kind of go 17-0 the rest of the way. It's impossible. I mean, they can do it because they're technically still in it, but I doubt that that will come to fruition. And that's kind of sad because you kind of would like be nice to see your team win 15 in a row. That would be pretty cool. I mean, I know the Buffalo Sabres were, hovering around that for a little bit, and it's not impossible, but it's certainly not feasible with the way that this roster comes out. And even if they end up getting, undefeated, uh, their undefeated marks, they still might not get in. 98 points is essentially the target for the wild card potentially this year. Unless teams just start cratering, then that's pretty much where it is. So, they've won. They're building good habits. Hopefully this sort of keeps Adam Fox, and I don't want to say make his advantage ad because he definitely wants to stay and he definitely should stay. Uh, hopefully Adam Fox has a change of heart. He hasn't exactly requested a trade, but he's definitely not satisfied with how things have gone so far. But hopefully this kind of nice little spurt of games can really, get the guys kind of thinking, well, you know what, if we were full power next season, then things could work out. And honestly, I think it would, because if you really think about it, if Drury's smart enough, I'm still very critical of him, but if he can bring in another defenseman, it doesn't have to be anybody expensive, but you would have to assume that Braden Schneider's going to get traded at some point. With Lafreniere's breakout, they're definitely not going to trade him now. So Schneider's pretty much one of the few that can actually be had for a decent haul outside of Vincent Trocheck. So when you have all of that coming together, and then obviously if Perreault, Zibanejad, and Lafreniere are playing well, Sullivan has to have the right sense of mind to keep them together this season and next. So then that means that if you do end up trading Vincent Trocheck, JT Miller would be your second line center, or JT Miller's your first line center, and those three are your second line, and you have to fill out the rest with a high draft pick and a player in free agency. So that kind of really rounds out the top six, and that kind of really rounds out the team in general, because if you think about it, Matthew Robertson has kind of defied all of our expectations and has become a pretty reliable defenseman back there. Well, I'm not saying that he's going to be a spark plug and be the greatest defenseman of all time, but he's been very satisfactory as a third pair defenseman. You would hope that whoever they bring in can complement Will Borgen. You obviously have Fox and Gavrikov. You want to have somebody that can complement Will Borgen to kind of elevate him to second D status. And I think Will Borgen can be a second defenseman. Before Will Borgen got hurt earlier this year, before the break, he was trending upward in terms of his metrics as a defenseman. But obviously injuries derail things, especially for defensemen, and sometimes it takes a bit for them to really get back into the swing of things, especially when you're dealing with upper and lower body injuries. And I think he was dealing with a mix of both. So uh, I definitely still have a lot of faith in Will Borgen. Obviously, there's also Scott Morrow, who, even though he's not on the team right now, he could end up being that guy if he trains and can fix some of those inconsistencies in his game over the summer, because he could still be very, very good. The odd man out, obviously, here is Braden Schneider. Now, then also, too, you have to factor in that maybe Drew Fortescue gets a shot next year in camp. Maybe, somebody else comes in that's a prospect, like the family member of Sergei Gonchar. Maybe he makes an impact, probably still young enough to be here. And then if you think about it, too, there's also other options for like the third line. They just signed Brody Lamb to his entry level deal. He may not compete for a spot now, but he could definitely make some noise for next season. Um, so that it's not as flashy as people want it to be, but the Rangers could be in a far worse position. I've been saying this for pretty much the better part of the whole season. I know that Chris Drury is not the best general manager in the world. I know that the team doesn't really have a bunch of starling prospects coming through in the system. But with this recent emergence of Lafreniere and the coming out of Gabe Perreault, that kind of solves a lot of the issues that has gone on with this team over the last year and a half, you know, because it would essentially that would be the beginning of your retool. You get rid of all the guys from the old guard, Kreider, Kako, Heedle, Truba, and you essentially kind of change majority of that. And also, too, let's give credit where credit is due. Mika Zibanejad is having a renaissance of a season. And again, I've said this before, and I'm not trying to say, oh, I was right, because I could have been just as wrong. But I'm happy to see that what I'm saying, or at least of what I've said, at least in certain things, has become it's come to fruition, like Mika Zibanejad. The only way was up, whatever he was dealing with personally. I'm happy that it seems like that's been taken care of, where he's handling things a lot better now. He seems to be more focused. He has a coach that believes in him. So, and then you look at his contract, which, as the cap is going up, that's going to be the going rate for centers. So the fact that you're able to have this guy essentially on a discount with his skill set that can still get you 25 goals, that's huge. And if you're talking, and mind you, we're talking about a retool, we're not talking about a rebuild. So ideally, you have to find out how productive everyone's going to be within the next season and a half. So I'm counting next season and even the season following that, right? So if they continue to keep all of this upward momentum going, then they can make noise. Mike Sullivan's not going to be here he didn't come here to tear everything down. Mike Sullivan knows that he has skill on this team. And I'm hoping, again, like I said during the deadline show and numerous times over the year, is that I hope that Mike Sullivan's influence can rub off on Chris Drury and allow him to make better personnel decisions. We can't fire the guy. I'm not James Dolan. You would hope that there was another executive out there that can handle this, but we just kind of have to wait and see at this point. Am I totally confident he's going to make the right move? I don't know. I can't say for sure. I'm not too optimistic in that regard, but I also have to think, well, if this has gone well, then what else can possibly go well? But again, just to kind of put a damper on the whole, it's going to be the Dark Ages kind of thing. No, I don't think there was anybody remotely close to the skill set that Gabe Perreault has on those teams. Maybe Radek Dvorak, maybe Peter Nedved, but he wasn't homegrown. There was a lot of older skill on those teams. And yes, you have JT Miller. Yes, you have Mika Zibanejad. Yes, you have Vincent Trocheck. But none of those teams had an Alexis Lafreniere or a Gabe Perreault. Heck, they don't even think they really had much of a Will Cooley to a degree. Maybe they did. It's just not coming to me right now. And if you're listening to this and you want to correct me and, give me a name of somebody who, the only person I can think of that was probably similar, and I apologize in advance if I'm missing a couple of names who are very similar to Will Cooley, but the only one that I can think of off the top of my head that is similar to Will Cooley is Todd Harvey. That's it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, well, definitely not Matthew Barnaby. I think Cooley is a lot more skilled than Matthew Barnaby, of course. Definitely not Sandy McCarthy, but you get my point. So there is a way out of this. It just all depends on how Chris Drury handles this and what he does to supplement what he has coming up on the roster so far. Some pretty good decisions have been made, and you just hope that can continue. So that's pretty much my thoughts on that. And I know Rob and Dave will have their thoughts coming up next week in regards to how the young kids have played and how things have gone. So, all right. So we sent out for questions, and we appreciate you coming out and asking questions for us because this definitely keeps us occupied. So let's go. Let me just check Blue Sky real quick. I'll be honest with you, I've been dropping the ball a bit. I've been wanting to make posts off of the Twitter account devoted to the show. And I'm playing my hand here, but I'm also just truthfully, brutally honest. as I, usually go about this. Um, that's my fault. But stuff happens, life happens, things get in the way. Um, Also, just to quickly mention that JT Miller is returning against the Minnesota Wild, who will play tomorrow night. If you're listening to this, I'm recording this Friday, and they play Saturday at 6. Um, so you know, that's sort of like, all right, well, that's cool, I guess. Sure, JT Miller's gonna go back on the top line, top power play. All you can do is hope is that if JT Miller goes on the first unit and they're looking like absolute garbage, you have to pivot because the power play has looked phenomenal with Gabe Perreault, Alexis Lafreniere, and Mika Zibanejad. I'm always in the thought process that if you're putting your power play together, you have to have your whole first line there. Colorado is a perfect example of that back in the day when it was McKinnon, Rantanen, and Landeskog. You know, Maybe they probably threw Arturi Lehkonen in there with, Cale Makar. So if that doesn't tend to work out, you would hope Sullivan would pivot because that second power play unit doesn't really get any traction. They haven't really needed to use them, truth be told. So, all right. So I found some questions on Blue Sky. So we'll go to those first, and then we'll read the questions on the blog. Again, thank you to everyone who submits these questions. We love answering your questions. We love giving our feedback, and we appreciate the engagement. So this first question comes from Outside the Garden at otghockey.bsky.social. Thank you very much for your question. And they ask, while a number of those comments are over the top, I think it's a bit premature determining that Laugh has debunked them. It's encouraging to see him get on the score sheet, but these have often been against poor quality opponents in a similar position, and it's been such a small sample size. That's a fair assessment. I wouldn't totally, uh I wouldn't totally put that comment down because I mean it is correct. It is a small sample size coming off of the break. Everybody's well rested. Um and it just seems that they played Toronto, who's been garbage, the Flyers, who's also been garbage. The Devils, even though he did look good in that Devils game, scored a goal in that game. They're not the best. I mean, the Devils are only 6 points behind or 6 points ahead of the Rangers, so they're in just as big of a free fall as the Rangers were before the break. And then Winnipeg is Winnipeg, and Calgary is just absolutely awful. But I think what it is though, and I think the game against Minnesota, and then some of their opponents coming up like LA, and again New Jersey, which they always play the Rangers tough, and even Ottawa, who is currently in the thick of a playoff spot. We'll see then. But I just think the excitement is just that people are seeing Alexis Lafreniere get the time that he deserves. Because I mean, I was reading somewhere that out of all of the prospects from that 2020 draft, Alexis Lafreniere has seen the least amount of power play minutes. But also too, you know, somebody also mentioned, and I saw this there, that with them trading Panarin, a guy like Alexis Lafreniere for most of his life, and I apologize to whomever said this, it's not my thought, it's this person's thought, and I agree with it, is that Lafreniere has been so used to being the driver all of his career in the juniors that it became sort of different that he became the passenger. And you could probably point to that dynamic that they had. Yeah, they've had success together with Trocheck and Panarin with Lafreniere on their wing, but Panarin is a very stingy player when it comes to the puck. He likes to have the puck. He likes to shoot the puck. And Vincent Trocheck is the perfect guy for that, who can dish him the puck. It and to a degree, Mika Zibanejad had some success with Panarin, but not the best, but he would try and dish him the puck. And obviously him being your leading scorer and your basically best player for years, why would you not want to give the puck to Artemi Panarin? But at the same time, if your Panarin's not going to move over to right wing, Lafreniere's playing out of his position. Not to say that he couldn't do it, but you could definitely tell that there was some sort of progress being impeded in that regard. So yes, I do agree that it could be over the top, that everybody is kind of going on their minds, but it's just nice to see. I think that's where a lot of that's coming from. It's encouraging, and and what you want is consistency, like I said before. So, um, so yeah, so thank you, Outside the Garden. Appreciate that comment. I definitely do agree. Um, this next question, or this comment, comes from dsam at dsam1921.bsky.social, and they say, laugh legit, question mark, question mark, question mark. Then they go, realistically, this hot streak won't last, but what do you expect to see from now, since he's going to be a guy for at least the rest of the season? Maybe not the guy, but a guy, enough of a guy to be enough of a guy good enough to entice teams for a trade, or maybe keep during the rebuild. Thoughts? I think the rest of the season he might cool off within the next couple of games, especially if he plays against tougher opponents. But I think what you're going to see is the continuation of the scoring chances that they generate. You know, and I have to always say if, because Mike Sullivan can change his mind. But I think that they're going to keep those three together for the rest of the season. That being said, if that's the case, then they're going to generate a lot of offense. There might be some nights over the next couple of games where they do that and it just doesn't go into the back of the net. But if it doesn't go into the back of the net, it's encouraging to see that they're still generating offense. This is the point in time, especially with the situation the team is in, that you just want to see, like I said, good behaviors being stressed. And if they continue to go out and just make good plays and play solid hockey, then you want to keep that. You would want to keep that. He's only 25. Players who have a similar skill set would definitely command more on the market. So I'm not saying that he's going to be a total discount, but it's good to have a young, productive top six forward at your ready that can potentially break out onto another level. That sort of depth is what does teams well. You definitely have to add in the summer, you know, whether it's Alex Tuck or Jason Robertson. Those are the only two names that I could think of. I'm not sure what else is really out there unless there's this sort of big earth shattering trade, but you're essentially going to have to see what this is. And if he is even the guy or a guy, as long as he's putting up points and putting it in the back of the net, or assisting somebody else putting it in the back of the net, that's what you want. Ideally, even though he is a first round pick and you want him to score at least 90 points, you know, it would be cool to get at least about 65, 70 out of him. And I think it's realistically possible. I mean, the way that he played in juniors, and in some of the instances we've seen in the NHL, that just doesn't go away. A lot of what Lafreniere is dealing with is a mental thing. And if he's given the opportunity to just kind of do his thing without anybody usurping him, or, not having Panarin in the way, I think that would make him a guy just enough that they keep him. And look, this is something that if you see a good sign, you have to ride the wave and see what happens, because this will allow you to kind of have a better feel of the team, or at least for Chris Drury to have a better evaluation of the team. He should be here next season, Lafreniere. The one out of everyone that should get traded is Braden Schneider. Alexis Lafreniere should be here. It's hard to, as critical as we are of him, it's hard to come by players like that at this juncture, especially with the situation that the Rangers are in. Nobody is just giving up players for nothing. It's one of the reasons why Dallas hasn't traded Jason Robertson yet, because they still probably feel they could strike a deal with him. You know, if Jason Robertson was as much of a pariah as people kind of make it out to be with Dallas, and they haven't really re-upped him yet, he would have been traded a long time ago. But you don't just give up on talent like that. And yeah, I know Jason Robertson has been more productive than Alexis Lafreniere, but it's just the point that you just don't give up on young guys like that. And Dallas is still in the thick of it, for all things considered. So it makes no sense for them to just let go of a 100-point guy because he's oh well, my contract hasn't been re-upped yet. Well, you're winning games. You're in the playoff. Think of the playoffs. You'll deal with that bridge when you cross it. So I think Lafreniere is going to be here. Now, if they do find a way to end up trading him, it has to be for someone who is going to make a difference. You're not going to trade a 25-year-old scoring left winger with high upside if you're not going to get somebody who is elite. If you were going to trade Schneider and Lafreniere, it's going to have to be for a top line player, not an Alex Tuck type player. It would have to be similar to like a Jack Eichel style player with a bunch of first round picks and maybe another prospect. That's what he would have to be involved in. But if he's going to be, he may not be the guy, but he can be a guy to the point where he can still do a lot for this team. And I believe in him. I've been very critical of him. There have been times where I've wanted to trade him, but that's just more out of frustration than anything. But I'm glad to see that he's coming through. I think he's just going to be a guy, and I think this is legitimate. So thank you, DSAM, for that. Continue to submit your stuff on socials, and we will answer them to the best of our ability. So this next question, now on the blog post, and this question comes from Kerr1940, and they ask: Crosby, Kane, Kucherov, Kopitar were under 28 when they won their last cup. Can Tro, JT, and Zib do it all at 33? Well, if they put the team together properly, absolutely. Once you get into the playoffs, anything can happen. There's still enough skill between all three of those guys that can elevate a team in the playoffs. Mika Zibanejad has a solid track record in the playoffs. JT Miller has also a pretty solid track record in the playoffs with Vancouver. And Vincent Trocheck, we've seen what he can do if the Rangers decide to keep him. 100% I think they could. Now, granted, Crosby, Kane, Kucherov, and Kopitar, those guys were on a different level. Those guys could carry games on their own. But I can't say that too much about these guys. Maybe Mika Zibanejad, maybe JT Miller when he's healthy. Definitely not Vincent Trocheck. No offense to him. But I still think they can do it because if you properly supplement the team the way it should be with depth scoring and solid defense, you don't have to worry about goalie. Igor Shesterkin's going to be Igor Shesterkin. But you get one more defenseman, add another winger or two, especially with a high draft pick, and all of a sudden your team is a bit quicker than it was to the start of last season. And I think that will make a difference. And with the way Sullivan's system is very similar to what, the Panthers and the Vegas Golden Knights want to play, it can happen. The Rangers have a lot of good bottom six depth. A lot of people tend to forget that they have a lot of solid bottom six depth, and a lot of that goes a long way in the playoffs. I think Will Cooley, he can work on his game over the summer. Not in that way if you're thinking about the tweet. But I think if Will Cooley can add a bit more size and kind of, work on his game a little bit more in terms of the offensive side, they're going to be in prime position. And I know Will Cooley can do it. So could they do it at 33? Absolutely. This next question comes from NYC Crash, and they ask, do you think they will make the playoffs this year? I don't, but curious if you think they can dig their way out of this hole of the season. No, it's too late. Like I said earlier, they would have to pretty much win out. And with some of the opponents that they're playing, especially with Buffalo coming up, Montreal's coming up, they play Dallas in Dallas, just to name a few, Tampa Bay. I don't think it's going to happen. And I'm usually the optimist. I'm usually the optimist out of everybody here, but I'm also realistic, At this point, what I really want to see is just them playing well, but them being in a position enough to where they can have a high draft pick, because then you kind of put it together and start off fresh next season. And next season will be a lot different because, the Olympic break won't be happening. So you're going to have an all-star game and the games will be more spread out. I'm not saying it's an excuse, but and this is not just with the Rangers. This is pretty much the entire NHL. Olympic seasons have condensed schedules, So you basically had hockey on every day or every other day. And especially if you play a rough and tumble type system, and even if you're not as skilled as other teams, that takes a toll after a while. And obviously we saw it with JT Miller. Vincent Trocheck was out for some time. Adam Fox clearly is still dealing with, his knee issues and his lower body issues. Igor Shesterkin was out for a bit, and you have all this hockey condensed into a small time frame. Usually when you have one small bounce, you can rebound from it, but there were a lot of bounces that didn't go their way, and it tanked their season, and that happens. Am I happy about it? No, of course not, because of course I want to see the New York Rangers go to the playoffs. I love going to the Garden for playoff games. It's like a place like no other, you know. But it just didn't. The cards didn't pan out this season, and honestly, I think it's good because with the constant messaging of them wanting to get younger and faster, the fact that they're going to have hopefully a high draft pick in a solid draft class with the top 5 at least, that really solves a lot of the issues, or it could solve a lot of the issues that this team has really been facing. So, do I think they make the playoffs? Positive JL says no, unfortunately. If they do, oh boy, will I be happy. But also it comes at the cost of a draft pick because, that essentially prices you out of, you know, a top 4 pick, but I don't think it's going to happen. I would probably say, though, that the Devils will probably get closer to the Rangers than most think. That team is cratering like crazy. You say what you want about Chris Drury, but the Devils are in a way worse position than the Rangers are because they have all of these bloated contracts. You see, at least with Drury, and look, and this is very low hanging fruit. Bar is really low here. Okay. At least with Chris Drury, he was at least trying to get rid of the fat that he needed to get rid of. So it's like, Barclay Goodrow and Jacob Trouba and Chris Kreider, even though I didn't like the way that he handled the Kreider situation, he needed to be moved, especially if you're going to bring up a guy like a Gabriel Perreault. You can't have Chris Kreider on the same team as Perreault and divvy up their time, even with a guy like Artemi Panarin. So it had to happen. Did I agree with the way they did it? No. Tom Fitzgerald, on the other hand, has sort of this weird, bloated team that, yeah, they beat the tar and feather out of the Rangers, but at the same time, though, it's like their goaltending situation is terrible. Yeah, let's sign Jacob Markstrom and have him give up 5-6 goals a game, and we're stuck with that big money that we've given him. Jack Hughes, Nico Hischier, great players. Hate to see them play against the Rangers. They're good players, Jesper Bratt. I would love Jesper Bratt would fix a lot of the Rangers' problems if we were to get a guy like that. So it could be worse. You could be the New Jersey Devils, and they might actually, if they keep cratering, they can really be close into the mix on fighting the Rangers for a draft pick. Fingers crossed they don't. They can kind of meddle out there, but anyways, next question comes from, I love this name. Again, thank you so much. I don't think I'm deserving of it, but I appreciate your your name. Producer JL Praise Account. That is not me. I do not have an account to comment on things, even though Dave said I should. But I wouldn't be so overt in my name doing that. I'd probably just make a name that'd make fun of Dave. So the producer JL Praise account asks, with the fair amount of cap space, is it dead nuts certain that Drury is going to sign Alex Tuch for something stupid like 10 to 12 million a year, isn't it? I think it's going to happen. My prediction would be that they're building up all this draft capital to potentially either make a big trade or have enough for like an RFA deal for Jason Robertson. Jason Robertson has been linked to the Rangers in the past. The Rangers have 2 first-round picks this year so far. They have a bunch of thirds. They have a second. I think they have 2 seconds, if I'm correct. But they have a lot of draft capital so far, So what does that tell you? RFA contracts. Jason Robertson wants upwards of at least 11 million, 10 to 11 million a year. So I think that might be the primary target. But if let's just say Dallas matches and decides to keep Jason Robertson to that match deal, then yes, I do see them trading for or signing an Alex Tuch. And truth be told, I don't think it's going to be a long-term commitment. It might just be 5 years. I'm hoping that the most that contract would be with 10 million. But then also you have to remember the cap is going up. And I know Tuck is on the other side of 30. I understand that. But at the same time, you have to see it this way in the sense that if they end up getting a high draft pick, fingers crossed they get number 1 and Gavin McKenna's the guy. Or ideally you want it to be Gavin McKenna, Tynan Lawrence, Ivar Stenberg, or like I said, Manny Malhotra's kid. Any one of those guys would fit in well to what the Rangers are doing. And when you have a guy like that or a player like that with Lafreniere and Gabe Perreault, then you can afford to bring in a guy like an Alex Tuck. For 5 years is what I hope. Now, if they sign him to a longer-term deal, you would hope that number goes down under 10. And with the cap going up, it wouldn't hurt as much in the future as many would think it would. Again, that's with the anticipation that the cap is going to be at least over 100 and change within the next couple of years. Now, after 2 years, the idea becomes, well, do you go after Connor McDavid? That's gonna be out there. I don't see McDavid signing another deal with Edmonton unless they end up winning the cup within the next year and a half. So everybody and their mothers is going to want to sign McDavid. And I think that with the cap going up, they're going to weaponize that cap space that they have. Because ideally, some players may come off the books, some players may end up getting traded between now and then. So you would hope that with whatever cap space he has now currently can weaponize it enough where they can be competitive. And then when it goes up more, they can go and end up get a guy like a McDavid to kind of, put them over the top. Because if you get Connor McDavid, I mean, who cares who plays defense? I mean, you can just throw him out there with, Perreault and they'll be fine. So thank you, producer JL praise account. I want to see that more often. So thank you very much. Light the Lamp asks, JT doesn't fit a retool or rebuild. His age, injury prone. His skills are in decline. His lack of leadership is evident. Ask them what is the plan for him. I'd have to somewhat disagree. I think JT Miller is, a huge move for a retool, not for a rebuild. But then you also have to put it this way. We all love Filipino. Filipino was one of my favorites. He was, nothing but a warrior for this team. He was always filling in and doing what he needed to do. But unfortunately, because I don't know whether it's he can't protect himself or he just finds himself in these really vulnerable positions, he was not a useful player anymore for the Rangers, at least. I wish him nothing but the best in Vancouver and just in life in general, because you don't want to see that happen to such a young kid. He's not even 30 yet, and he could potentially be out of the NHL after potentially another bad hit. I don't even think he's playing right now because he sustained another concussion. And it's a shame because Filipino has such an amazing skill set down the middle. That being said, JT Miller has produced somewhat for this team, and they're getting more from JT Miller than they did with Filipino. Do I wish JT Miller was a bit younger? Of course, because there is still some skill there. But, his skills aren't going away overnight. He's dealt with a really bad leg injury. He should have just sat, honestly. But when you're the captain of a team, just named the captain of the team, and you want to play in the Olympics, you're not going to tell a hockey player no, especially when he's somewhat able to perform duties on the ice, even though it hasn't been exactly what we've wanted. They traded for him last year, and he was arguably the best player on the team last season. He was everywhere and everywhere. That just doesn't go away over the couple of months. So the hope is that he can come in fully healthy, not get injured in training camp and ruin his bottom half, and can be a reasonably productive player. Whether it's his whether you want to talk about his lack of leadership, whatever. I'm not in the locker room. I can only speak on what they've said publicly, and yeah, it does seem like he's falling short a bit, but sometimes what you see in the media when they're talking is not the full picture. Mika Zibanejad has come out. I think it was when they had traded for Miller, and at least over the summer too. Mika has given JT Miller praise. So I wouldn't doubt that. I think just a lot of what's gone on this season has just weighed on them heavily, and he's not going to give the answers that we want to hear. But I doubt that they're, he could he have said some things better? Yeah, of course. Especially before the break, where it's like, well, I don't know what's going on. That's not really ideal, but I'm sure the guys appreciate it. I mean, there was that picture they took of them all. I think that was Trocheck being held, and Miller was there, and they all just seemed like they were having a good time. Again, I can't speak for it. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't know, but that's it's kind of tough. The plan is Miller's going to be here for at least another 2 seasons. This season, the next season, and the following season. Um, his cap hit is, again, the cap is going up, so it's going to be easier to absorb. And you just kind of have to run with it and see what happens unless they trade him, which I don't think anyone will take that on unless the Rangers are really out of it. But if the Rangers are anywhere near a contention spot, they're gonna keep him. He does have some skill left, and it was very evident when they traded for him last season. And this last question comes from Nikki70, and they ask, how far-fetched is it to assume that the reason Drury held off trading Trocheck is because he may have a potential deal with a new team that will be added to the no-trade clause? Since July 1st, the NTC moves from 12 teams down to 10, or is this pure fantasy? Well, I mean, I wouldn't rule that out. That could be a possibility, but he has come out and said that, they had a price, they didn't meet it, and they have no problem keeping him. You know, I like that he did that. He didn't do it with Panarin, but at the same, obviously it's slightly different circumstance, but um, I like that he held firm. That's the one thing I'll give Chris Drury credit is he stood firm with his asking price, and it has to benefit him because Trocheck is really a viable asset. Now you can talk about, oh well, they lost another year and it's a depreciating asset. Yeah, we know that's obvious, but teams are still going to pay for things like that. You just need to find the right one. Minnesota could have easily have traded Daniil Yurov or even Charlie Stramel and a first round pick or a high draft pick for Trocheck. The Red Wings could have possibly given up a prospect and a first for him, and a roster player. All those teams are in the hunt. Why not? Shoot, Carolina could have done it too. Bradley Nadeau, first round pick, and Jesperi Kotkaniemi. Granted, Kotkaniemi is a little underwhelming, but he's an NHL player. So that could have been it. I like that he held firm to his laurels. He stuck to his guns, at least in that regard. And if, something may come a bit better in the offseason where they might package a Trocheck with a Braden Schneider for a player that fits their needs. I think once we find out where the Rangers pick, that will begin to tell you more about what they could potentially do. Now, this plan that I have in mind is something that is the only logical way that I can think of them going about it. I don't know if there's any other trades that are kind of in the pipeline on what they're potentially looking at. I don't have access to their files, but just looking at what's out there from a fan's perspective, Jason Robertson, Alex Tuck, high draft pick, get a defenseman, and then you're basically back in the discussion for next season. Because again, the team wants to get quicker and faster, and that's kind of the way to do it. If they trade Trocheck to kind of relieve cap space, then it would have to at least bring somebody who they can toss into the fire and have as a top 6 player for next year. Because, if you trade Trocheck, which, could, depending on what that, the his contract stipulations end up deciding, like you said, could a new team come in and potentially, have a better offer? Then yeah, if they come with a better offer, you take it. But that has to be somebody or a package that allows for them to have maneuverability, because if that's the case, and JT Miller goes back to center, and then you can fill out the rest. So is it pure fantasy? No, it's really not. Maybe he just decided to kick the can down the road. It's really not. It's not far-fetched to think that. I think that's actually a pretty logical thing to think about, because if nobody met his demands and somebody else can come in and meet that demand, then ideally he would have done his job properly, and that's what you're supposed to do is maximize the value of the asset that you currently hold. And realistically speaking, too, like I said, he can also just keep Trocheck. He can. He can just keep him. You know, if you really want to sell the retool quicker, hey, we're going to keep Trocheck, and now we have a plethora of wingers and centers, and you can just go about the way that I mentioned it before, where depending on where they pick, you got a high draft pick, fingers crossed, Gavin McKenna, and then you just sign a free agent or an RFA, and there they are. They're right back in the midst of it. So yeah. So that's what I think of that. It's not far-fetched, Nikki 70, at all, by any means. That's a very logical thing to think about. So anyways, we were approaching 55 minutes. I didn't think I was talking that long. So I think we reached everything. And yeah, first of all, I think the last thing I want to say is just, I don't think it's as bad as people are putting it out to be. It's not great. I'll tell you that, the situation the team is in right now. It's not great. But it's nice to see some of the kids really kind of making their mark, and it's an encouraging sign. We haven't gotten to the point where it's consistent yet, but you want to see more of this consistently over the next couple of games, and hopefully this carries into next season. So Rob and Dave will hopefully be back next week. And that pretty much kind of puts a topper on this one. Please like and subscribe our YouTube channel. Feel free to find us on uh, our audio platforms, and hopefully the Rangers can win and still stay within the bottom four. Up your odds for Tankathon, and then we'll have the rest of the summer to figure it out. Baseball's here, so but we will say though that once the season ends, we'll have coverage on the draft, we'll have coverage on free agent frenzy, and we'll have discussions for you about Rangers hockey all throughout the summer. But as of right now, season's still in full form. We've got a couple of games left, and we'll be here to take you every step of the way. So thank you for listening. Let's go Rangers, and we'll talk to you next week.